Okay, so let's start with some basic genetics. Let's say that this is your dad, and this is your mom, and one of these two is you. Sorry about that, by the way. The way that genetics works in sexually reproducing organisms is that for every gene that you have, let's think about maybe the gene for hair color, you're going to get two copies of the gene. So you get one copy of the gene from your dad and one copy of the gene from your mom. So you are going to have two complete sets of genes. You get one from your mom. Here's the one from your mom right here. And you're going to get one from your dad. Now, each of those sets of genes is called an allele. Okay. Now, they don't have to be exactly the same. For example, your mom could give you a red-haired allele, and your dad could give you a blonde-haired allele. And we'll talk about this a lot more later in the course, but one of those usually is going to win out. So you'll either get blonde hair or you'll get red hair. In this case, we're going to say that the blonde-haired allele wins out, and so you get blonde hair. Now, the really important words that we're going to be using for this is the word genotype. Genotype is what your genes actually are. So you have these two alleles, and that is your genotype. One we said for blonde hair and one for red hair. And the other word that's important is phenotype. So the phenotype is what actually is expressed. So you might have a gene for red hair and a gene for blonde hair, but only the blonde hair gene is being expressed. So that's really important to understand as we move on to talk about Darwin and evolution. So it's important to realize that Darwin did not actually come up with the idea of evolution. What he did was he came up with a way that evolution could happen, a way that one animal could be changed into another species of animals. And that way was natural selection. Okay. The idea of natural selection is based on the fact that if you look at a certain species, let's take these finches over here for example, some finches are going to have small beaks, some are going to have larger beaks. We call that genetic variation. And in every population, there is genetic variation. We see this in humans, for example. Some humans are taller than others. Some humans have types of muscle that allow them to perform well in endurance sports. Some humans have muscle that allows them to perform well in explosive power sports. This is just natural genetic variation. And the theory of natural selection says that sometimes these different phenotypes, whether it's little beaks and big beaks or whatever it might be, those different phenotypes have a different chance of survival and they also have, and this is the really important one, they have a different chance of reproduction. Because the truth is, it doesn't matter as far as evolution is concerned if you survive for 1,000,000 years or 2 years. What matters is, do you pass your genes on to the next generation? If you live for 120 years because you've got these great genes, this amazing phenotype, but you have no children, that phenotype isn't passed on to the next generation, and so it's not actually helpful for evolution. So this idea of your chance of survival and reproduction, that is called your fitness in biological terms. So Darwin says different organisms have different fitness because of their different phenotypes. So if we look at the example of these finches over here, These finches have these different phenotypes, and that was fine. They lived together perfectly okay until 1977. Darwin was not around to observe this, of course. This is a more recent example. In 1977, there was a drought, and that drought caused a shortage of seeds that the birds feed on. So what that meant was, if you could eat the seeds that were available, then you were more likely to survive and more likely to reproduce. The birds with the larger beaks, it turns out, during the drought, they were able to eat bigger, tougher seeds that they normally had ignored. And so birds with a larger beak were more likely to survive. Remember, they had greater fitness. And what that led to was an increase in the number of birds with large beaks, because they were the ones that didn't starve and they passed their genes on to the next generation, so their children also had larger beaks. So in this case, large beaks became what we call an adaptation. An adaptation is any trait of an organism that provides the animal with an advantage in a particular environment. Any adaptation is going to increase your fitness as an organism. But keep in mind that not all of the small-beaked birds became extinct. They didn't go away, which was actually good, because these finches, just a little while later in 1985, had to survive 2 years of really wet weather. And all that wet weather created lots and lots of small, soft seeds that all of a sudden, the birds with little beaks had greater fitness. And so the birds with little beaks survived in record numbers. And so what we see here is that anytime we have a population, the healthiest thing is to have a great variety of different phenotypes, because you have a better chance that if the environment changes, one of those phenotypes is going to survive. That's why we always want to have very high variation in any natural population. Okay. So the other thing we need to talk about here is the idea of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Now, Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is a little bit hard to understand at first because it's a theory that explains what would happen for no evolution to occur. So these were some scientists who kind of wanted to play devil's advocate, you could say. And they were wondering, all right, what if evolution doesn't exist? All right, or what if it doesn't exist for a population? What would have to happen in order for the number of genes in a population to stay constant from year to year? In other words, they wanted to know what it would take for there to be no change in what we call the gene pool. Now, a gene pool is all of the alleles, all the genotypes in a population. So all of the number of big beak alleles and all the number of little beak alleles. And this required a bunch of different assumptions. If a population was going to be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, in other words, it was going to have no evolution, you had to assume certain things. And the assumptions were that you had to have a really big population, you had to have no migration, nobody's coming in, bringing their genes in and messing things up. You had to have no mutation, so no random genes being created. You had to have completely random mating, so birds don't prefer one beak size to another. And this is the one we're focusing on today, you have to have no natural selection or artificial selection. Which means that it doesn't matter which beak size you have, you need to be equally likely to survive. Okay? Now, Hardy-Weinberg's equilibrium idea comes with a Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium equation. And the equation is right here. P squared plus 2pq plus q squared equals 1. And this is just a probability equation. So it talks about the p's here refer to the chance of having two copies of the same allele. So this might be birds that have two copies of the little beak allele. We're going to say that birds with little beaks have either one copy of the little beak allele and one copy of the big beak allele. So this means that little beaks win out if you have both. Or these little beak birds are going to have two copies of the little beak allele. A big beak bird has two copies of the big beak allele, and that's the only way to have a big beak. So this p squared refers to the probability of having two copies of the little beak allele, capital B, capital B. This term right here represents the probability of having two copies of, or sorry, having one copy of having each allele. So you'd have a big B and a little b, and then you'd have little beaks. And then this term right over here represents the chance of having two copies of the big beak allele and basically having a big beak. Now I want to just show you an example because that's going to be the easiest way for you to understand how Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium works. So let's say that in 1977 we go out and we measure that there are 82% of birds on the islands have little beaks. Okay, and we measure that 18% therefore have big beaks. What we want to find out is what is the actual gene pool? What are the percentages of big B alleles and little b alleles for little beaks and big beaks respectively? Well, we use our Hardy-Weinberg equation in order to do that. So we said that this term, q squared, was the chance of being little b, which represented having a big beak. So that means that in this case, q squared is going to be the chance of having a big beak. Now 18% or 0.18 of the birds had big beaks. So that means we can solve for q, which is actually the number of these alleles. Sorry, that's actually the number of little b alleles. Which is actually the number of these alleles right here, by just square rooting both sides. So if we take the square root of both sides, we're going to find out that q is 0.42, which means that 42% of all the alleles in the gene pool are little beak alleles. And just because it has to add up to 100, 58% of all alleles are going to be little beak alleles. Okay? Now the question we want to ask is, after that drought ended, was there the same number of alleles, or did the amount of alleles change? If the alleles change, or if the percent of alleles change, then we know that then evolution has happened. Because there was a change in the gene pool. So let's look at the data for that. We've got in 1977, we had, just so that we remember, we had 82% were little beaks, and we had 18% were big beaks. And then we look in 1980 and we find out that 37% of birds had little beaks and 42% had big beaks. Now that looks like it might be evolution. If we use Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, we can figure out what the percent of alleles would be. And we're going to use the number of big beaks to do that. I want you to try that and figure out how many big beak